Today, we are starting on the second of our two ethnographic case studies, the one for which we're reading Charles Lindholm's book, Culture and Authenticity. Now, the first book we read was about a hunter-gatherer culture, the San of the Dobe region in the Kalahari Desert. Now, as you'll recall, the San, as described in Nisa, lived in small hunter-gatherer bands, spending their lives chasing game and gathering foods across a vast and lightly populated desert of sand and scrub and small trees. They had some things in their culture that most of us have never run across, things like arrow poison and ostrich egg canteens and shamanistic healing. They also lacked some things that most of us take for granted, things like electric lights, writing, photographs, restaurants. When you first run into the San in a course like this, your first reaction, if you're like most people, is to say, boy, that's weird. And the people who live that way seem like really good subjects for something as intrinsically odd as anthropological investigation. Now, that's natural, of course. You get used to what you're familiar with, and everything else seems strange. But it's also kind of funny when you think about it. We take things like telephones and refrigerators and vaccines and social security numbers very much for granted. But of course, all of these technologies and the elaborate social structures that are attached to each of them are incredibly recent. Modern human beings, people biologically and mentally just like us, have been around for about 250,000 years. They've only been farming and living in civilizations for about 10,000 years. The technologies we just mentioned are much more recent than that. None of them go back much more than about 100 years. Everything we think about as modern culture has been around for less than 0.1% of the history of human beings. By any reasonable description, you would consider our society a bizarre aberration, a weird deviation from the way that most people have always lived. And that way of living, the modern world, is every bit as appropriate a subject for anthropological study as the San, the Gabusi, the Yanomamo, or any other tribal society in the world. Now, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at the society through an anthropological lens. We can't look at the whole thing. It's hard enough to do an ethnography of the few hundred people in the Dobe region, and characterizing the 6 billion or so people who live in what we could call modern societies today, that'd be a little much. Instead, we're going to focus on one particular feature of modern cultures, the quest for authenticity. Now, in our time today, we're going to talk a little bit about what modernity is and what Lindholm means by authenticity. After that, we're going to spend 3 lectures talking about how authenticity shapes some different aspects of modern culture, specifically ideas about ethnicity, ideas about expressive culture, and ideas about social action. Finally, we're going to see a film that explores the way that some of those issues come together in the social movement. Now, about the film. The film is called Jonestown, and I want to tell you 2 things about it. The first is that, like Up the Yansa, it's a full-length feature film, so it's kind of long. Now, for that reason, after today, the next 3 lectures are going to be on the short side. I want to be sure to give you enough time to get through the film. The other thing is that this film does not end happily. Jonestown was a settlement in South America that was founded by Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher from Indiana. Jones had developed a movement in Northern California in the 1970s called the People's Temple, which for a while became a very important part of the religious and political life of the San Francisco Bay Area. The temple and its members relocated to South America to build a utopia in the jungle, a home of their own that would be free from oppression and racism and interference from state authorities. On November 18th, 1978, though, almost all of them, 918 people, including more than 300 children, died in what's been described either as a mass suicide or as a combination of suicide and murder. Now, for those of us who were around in 1978, it was an indescribably shocking event, a loss of life of Americans that wouldn't be equaled again until the bombings of 9/11. This film traces the People's Temple from its origins in Jones's early preaching through its rise to prominence in Northern California, right through its final hours, the suicides themselves, which were recorded on tape and in pictures by people who were there. It's an important thing to see, I think, because it brings together a lot of the questions about authenticity that we're going to talk about over the next few days. And it demonstrates the extraordinary power that authenticity and charisma can generate in modern society. It's important to know about this, both as an anthropologist and as a person living in this age. I think that the recordings and the personal testimonies about the final day of the community that you see in this film will teach you things that it's good for you to know. But it's a hard thing to look at. I used to be able to get through it when I'd show it to one of my classes. But since my son died, I can't watch the end anymore. When you see it, you'll understand why. So while I would recommend very strongly that you watch this all the way through, I will certainly understand if you can't. The events of the last day in Jonestown have been documented in a lot of places, and if nothing else, there's a basic description of them on Wikipedia. If you'd rather just skip that last section and read about it on Wikipedia, please go right ahead. There won't be anything on any of the tests about the details of the suicides. Well, for now though, let's talk about something a little more cheerful. Most things are a little more cheerful than Jonestown. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean by modernity and by authenticity.